In this video we're going to look at construction project management. So construction project management is a lot simpler than consulting, a consultant's contract or the client's contract, and the reason for that is you've already pretty well defined what the project deliverables are going to be. So when you go right through the design process and the design development process and the tender contract production, at the end of that you've got a pretty good idea of what needs to be built. So the construction project initiation, it starts really with the tendering process. So this is the tendering process. We're talking about a DBB, by the way, design bid build type of procurement for the construction services. So the tender documents include all the detailed product scope descriptions and the specifications and drawings. So it's really well detailed, right down to the last, what metal the bolts are supposed to be made out of, all that sort of stuff. So there's the scope part of the project initiation in the tender document. Then the contractor needs to make a decision whether to be involved in the project or not. We'll talk about that in the next slide, or slide after next. And he may decide not to be involved, and we'll talk about that, as I said, later. He may decide that yes, we do want this project, and so they'll prepare a tender submission which will set out their attributes, which will set out their methodology, which will set out their previous experience and jobs of this type, all of that stuff that we looked at in engineering management. And it'll set out their price, so that's what the tender submission will have in it. The tender submissions are then submitted to the client, and usually the consultant processes it. They look at it, they check for arithmetic errors, and then they compare the different submissions and come up with a recommendation. This is the one that's best for you. Then the principal, the client, has a decision to make. Do they want to accept one of the tenders, or are they going to reject all of them? Now usually they accept one of them. They usually have gone to the market with the intention of hiring someone. But if they do reject them more, then you need to go right back to the start and redesign and all that sort of business. But if they do, and that's what usually happens, they either they or the consultant on their behalf sends a tender acceptance letter to the winning construction company, and that says we accept your submission, your proposal. So the tender submission that construction company submitted, it is accepted, and in doing that they have formed a legally binding contract. So they are now contractually bound, and essentially what that is the client's authorization to proceed with the project. That's what the tender acceptance letter does. And so you can see that the construction project's much easier to initiate because you've got the scope really well defined, and the acceptance is also quite a common sort of practice. Everyone understands how it happens. So yeah, it's pretty easy to initiate them. So looking at the tender document, the contract document in a little bit more detail. So you'll recall that there's a tender invitation. The tender documents set out the conditions of contract, the schedule of quantities, the specification, the drawings, and any background information. And that's enough information for the contractor to put together a price, a methodology, and that sort of business. During the tender period, there'll be meetings with all the tenderers. Remember, there's more than one contractor. Usually, there's 3 or 4 construction companies. Often, sometimes 10, whatever, competing for it. So they're all meeting. They're communicating with the consultant who's acting for the client. Then they all submit their submissions, their negotiations. So then they'll start negotiations with the preferred tenderer, the construction company that's made the best proposal, if you like. And there'll be some pre-award agreements. Then there'll be the tender acceptance letter, and that is where the client accepts the contractor's offer, the construction company's offer. And then you put together the contract document, which includes the tender document, the communications, tender submission from the contractor, including the price, the pre-award agreements, the tender acceptance letter. So together they comprise the construction contract, which is essentially a project charter, and it's also a scope statement. Now you won't find them being called that in the industry. We call them a contract document, but that is essentially what they are. So now I want to look at the early part of it, where the contractor, the construction company, needs to decide whether to be involved in the contract or not. So as was the case with the consultant, the construction company will receive an invitation to tender or request for proposals from the client. It'll either be advertised online so everyone can have a shot at it, or it might be the client or the consultant approaches them directly. And so they're saying, does it fit with our aims? Is it what we want to do? Is the client suitable? Does he have a good history of paying, basically? Can we do the work? Do we have the resources, the experience and the skills? Now they may have all of those things but not available. So they might have already won a couple of really big projects and say, well, we just don't have any available resources to do it because we've got it all allocated to these other projects. Conditions of contract, so that's NZS 3910, and that, if you recall, is agreement of a fair agreement which was agreed between representatives from contractors, organisations, representatives of clients' organisations, and representatives from consultancy organisations, and they sort of nutted out what they think is a fair agreement. And so most New Zealand contracts will use the conditions NZS 3910 conditions contract, and the reason why it's fair is because it's fair allocation of risk. So if something goes wrong, then who pays? So that's what risk is all about, and that's what NZS 3991 is all about, is fair allocation. Some clients decide to make their own conditions of contract because they think they're saving themselves money, and the contractor might look at that and say, well, no, those aren't fair on me. They're putting all the risk on me. If anything wrong happens, even if something that's beyond my control happens, I'm still going to pay for it. I'm either going to put massive amount on top of my price, or I'm just not going to bother bother submitting a tender. And then there's the cost of preparing the submission. How much is it going to cost us to prepare the submission, and what are our chances of winning? Because remember, there's usually 3, 4, up to 10 people bidding for this sort of thing. So if there's, say, 4 companies bidding, you've got a 1 in 4 chance of winning. You've got a 3 in 4 chance of having spent all that money preparing the submission and then not winning, in which case that money is gone. It's just a loss. You just write it off. So you want to look at your chances of winning. You don't want to go in if you don't think you've got a good chance. So that's why opening it up to everyone's a bit of a bad idea, because if you've got 10 other companies bidding, then the good companies are just going to say, oh no, I'm not going to bid for this one. I'm going to bid for one where I've got a better chance. So those are all the considerations that sort of need to come in. So really this initiation process has got 2 levels of authorization. The first one is within the construction company, where the construction company senior management decide, do we want to be involved in this project or not? Okay, and then the second one is where the client, where you win the tender and the client gives you authorization to do the project work. So there's 2 lots of authorization, one happening within the construction company and one happening where the client gives the construction company permission or authorization to carry out the contract works.